Hey everyone, welcome. I had a previous video where I took a popular and in-depth build guide for a beginner-friendly build called Enki's Archwitch, and I made a step-by-step video guide for how to get it kind of online through the first few acts. Which gems to take, which one could substitute, when to look for certain weapons, all that good stuff. That video had pretty good reception, so this is my follow-up where we will be doing the same thing for another build, taking an existing guide and walking through step by step until we at least get the build online with its first Labyrinth Ascendancy around Act 3 or 4. As a forewarning, this video is aimed at relative beginners, so if there are sections that you find you are already understanding, feel free to use the timestamps in the description to skip ahead, and if you are an advanced player, feel free to skip the video altogether and just follow Shack Central's written guide. More on that in a moment. I originally intended to make this video about a build that didn't have quite such an extensive guide as Archwitch did. Wintertide brand, my own leveling take on the very popular cold damage over time Occultist, made by a player named Shack Central. He's got another very beginner-friendly and thorough guide, like Enki's. As it turns out, though, right after I made my own switch to Wintertide brand as the preferred cold leveling skill, so did Shack Central. It seems like we were thinking along the same lines. Originally, this build used to use Vortex as its main damage dealer, while including a few other skills on the side that all added up together to make the damage happen. With Wintertide brand now taking center stage, Vortex sort of becomes a more co-equal partner in the build, rather than leading the way. Let's talk about what all that means and how you can try it out. So this build is going to focus on using multiple cold skills simultaneously, heavily featuring Wintertide brand as its main 6-linked damage-dealing skill in the endgame. Not long after finishing the campaign and transitioning to maps, there is a strongly recommended option to respec a bit into what's called Chaos Inoculation, commonly abbreviated CI. This is a keystone on the passive tree which sets your health to 1, but it says that chaos damage deals no damage to you. Under normal circumstances, chaos damage would bypass your energy shield, hitting your health directly. This means that no damage is bypassing your energy shield if you've taken Chaos Inoculation, which in turn means you can use Energy Shield as your main health pool. That's the design. This also has, of course, the massive added bonus of being entirely immune to all chaos damage, and a lot of endgame monsters feature chaos damage, so that's a big deal. This video isn't going to go far enough into the game to cover that transition. Like I said, that's more towards the end of the campaign and beyond, but I did want to mention it because it's an important feature of the build that you should know before selecting it. If there is any support for it, I'd be happy to do a follow-up video where we go into the specifics of that endgame transition, but I do think that the written guide does a pretty good job of that, so take a look at that. But both before and after the switch to CI, I want to tell you a little bit about the general feel of the build so you can decide whether it's right for you. The playstyle is that you have one skill, which is an instant cast cold skill bound to your left mouse click. This means that it's casting automatically and nearly constantly, dealing cold damage over time in an area around you. That skill is called Vortex, and again, it does not stop your character to cast it. You keep running, and if it's bound to your left click, it's just casting around you automatically. Simultaneously, you will be choosing strategic times as you run around to stop for a moment and lay down magical objects that spring towards enemies and waste them away with a fast-moving damage over time effect. You're timing your placement so that you can stop and avoid damage, then letting the skill take over and deal damage automatically while you get back on the run and stay safe. That skill is called Wintertide brand. In general, this build is tanky and beginner-friendly because it allows you to deal damage while moving around, prioritizing things like learning boss mechanics, dodging telegraphed attacks, and you can do all that without worrying that your DPS is dropping off. If that sounds good to you, let's proceed. So to start with, let's take a look at Path of Building. For those of you who aren't familiar, this is an amazing program that lets Path of Exile players share builds. Shack Central, who made this guide in particular, has, along with his excellent community of viewers put together this really outstanding and thorough path of building that shows every step along the way. It includes a lot of detailed notes. I honestly think that just following this written guide is probably plenty for most players to get started with the build, but making this video for those who prefer kind of a visual step-by-step. But I do want to say that a lot of effort clearly went into Shack Central's build guide, and it is great. So to get Path of Building, if you don't have it yet, to get it for the first time onto your computer, you just simply follow this link and download the latest version. It's very straightforward. So I will skip ahead to once the program has been installed and opened. Up at the top left here are our important navigation buttons. These let us skip between each of the important sections in Path of Building, or POB. The first one we're going to go to is the import-export, because we would like to import Shack Central's build. He's made a code. So what this section does is it basically translates everything about a build, all of the items, all of the passive tree, all of the gems. It translated into this series of letters and numbers. POB can interpret these, so all you have to do is give your friends or other Path of Exile players your POB code, and Path of Building will just load up their code, and so you can see what they're seeing. So once we've imported it, Path of Building has indeed scanned in everything important about the build. Like I said, gear, gems, passive tree. And I think the passive tree is where I would like to start us, because it is one of the most important sections, and it's also one of the most complex sections of the build. So as we click over to the passive tree, I've got to warn you, don't be intimidated by the default state of the tree. Like, this looks pretty wild, right? This is what the passive tree would look like after a very experienced player has put a lot of time and effort into it. Completely maxing out the character to level 100, spending what for most players would probably be weeks or months worth of currency. Certainly if you're a new player, you will probably not even make this much currency in your first league. So this is the ultra juiced up, specialized endgame version, but there are many intermediary versions along the way, letting you gradually crank up the power to your level of expertise with the game as you advance. So for that reason, this menu down here at the bottom left is extremely important. This is a drop-down menu that lets you swap between different versions of the tree, so that you can see which passives to take in which order. The different trees can kind of be used in two ways. You can, and both are used here. You can use it to go step by step throughout the campaign, which, as you can see, it does. It goes a couple acts at a time and shows what your passive tree ought to look like during those acts of the game. And you can also use it once all of the points have been allocated at the end to kind of flip-flop around different versions depending on which items you might have. That might change what you want your skill tree to look like. So this Path of Building does both of those things. There are a variety of options. So let's swap away from this level 100 trade league tree. Just as an aside, the trade designation there means that this passive tree is accounting for gear that you just have no chance of getting in a solo self-found environment. It's simply too rare, too expensive. You need a large number of people playing the game if you want any hope of seeing it. So instead, let's not look at this. Let's bring it all the way back to the beginning. What will you be doing in the first couple of acts? So remember, Path of Exile is a game with a 10-act campaign followed by the quote-unquote real game, which I do really mean that, aka the endgame Atlas of Worlds, which is where things really get started. So this introductory tree is something that even a beginner can expect to fill out in the first few hours of playing, and an experienced player will probably be getting this far in under 90 minutes. So let's highlight some of the main features of this introduction to the passive tree. Fair warning here, as we dive in to the first act, be warned that the first act contains by far the most information that we're going to have to cover. Since, look, this is when you're going to be getting set up for the first time. If you're new to the game, this is going to be when you're learning many of the basics for the first time. So because of that, the Act 1 section of this video takes up the vast majority of its runtime, just to kind of help you acclimatize yourself to the game if you haven't played before. So with that caveat out of the way, let's dive in. So first and foremost on this skill tree, see that the build starts here at the witch starting area. If you look closely, you can see that each of the 6 starting classes has a hub at the appropriate point around the tree, and that's where that class starts. All classes use the same skill tree, they just start at a different point at it. So the witch is up top here at 12 o'clock, shadow is over here at 2 o'clock, ranger here at 4 o'clock, duelist here at 6 o'clock, Marauder here at 8 o'clock, and then Templar over here at 10 o'clock. So, as we say, witch is right on the top, smack dab in the middle of the portion of the tree that has the most concentrated nodes concerning things like intelligence, spell damage, elemental damage, minions, mana, the type of things that you probably associate with a spellcaster witch type. So as you can see, it's always possible to navigate out of one's starting area to take other types of skill nodes elsewhere in the tree, but also, as you can see, it's much easier to specialize in what your starting class is nearest to. So you would need a really good reason to start as one class and then sprawl all over the tree getting other nodes. So the very, very first few nodes that we take on the passive tree, there are a few pathway options to get started with as the witch that lead out of the starting area and into the broader tree. There are 3 offensive pathways doing slightly different things and 1 defensive pathway. So there are chains of nodes here for, on the left, spell damage. Next to it is cast speed. Taking this path over here would be the defensive one if you wanted to prioritize energy shield first. And then this 4th one over here is for minion damage for those who are going to later transition to becoming a necromancer. This build in particular is going to start off taking pure classic spell damage along the far left here. This is a smart choice for us because our defense in these first few levels is going to be managed primarily by the fact that we're a ranged character using a cold skill. So the enemies are going to start far away from us, get slowed down on the way to us, and usually die before they can do much to us. However, once we reach this larger skill node here, and the larger ones are called notables, these are more powerful than their smaller counterparts, this node here called Arcanist's Dominion, once we reach here, we got a little bit of a choice about which order to take our next skills in. If you're feeling a bit squishy at this point, dying a little too easy, health plummeting too quickly despite being a ranged character, or if you're just annoyed by how often you have to use your mana flask, you can take a quick jaunt over here to the right to pick up these life and mana nodes first. Alternately, you could go straight north first, pathing through Frostwalker for some dedicated cold damage. You will end up taking those life and mana nodes next, it's just up to you which order you take them in. Now I do want to take a quick break from the passive tree before we continue, so that we can talk about what else will be going on at this early stage of the game while you're taking these first skill nodes. First and foremost, in the actual game itself, always keep your eyes open for Trials of Ascendancy. You need these trials to claim your Ascendancy, your endgame class of Occultist. Remember, there are 6 starting classes in the game, but each starting class has 3 subclasses or ascendancies to choose from. This build, as we know, will start as a witch and then eventually ascend to becoming an occultist. This is a subtype of witch that focuses on cold and chaos damage over time and things like using curses to debuff our enemies. Another thing to keep a sharp eye out here at the beginning of the game are the components for a couple of great vendor recipes that will get you some powerful weapons early on when gearing options would be otherwise limited. Vendor recipes are a way of turning in a specific combination of items to the vendor, who will then in turn give you a specific result back. For those of you who played any of the Diablo games, this is a bit like the Herodric Cube. You put a few specific things in and get a specific thing out in a recipe. So, We're going to start off with some spells that deal direct damage via hits. Those are the skills we're going to be using. And this is as opposed to damage over time, which we're going to switch to a bit later. The reason I mention that is that the first recipe we're going to look for is a wand that specializes in hit-based damage, not damage over time. The way that works is that it adds a flat amount of damage to all spell hits. And so the components we're going to want to look out for immediately to start making that wand as soon as we can are a magic rarity wand, so a wand that has a blue title, an orb of alteration, and any ring with a resistance implicit. Remember that implicit modifiers are those lines at the top of an item. Only some items have them, but these are at the top and they never change, no matter what crafting you do to the item. So for example, a sapphire ring will always have cold resistance at the top, a topaz ring will always have lightning resistance at the top, etc. The specific element of the ring we're going to choose for this recipe will determine what kind of damage is added to the wand, but in truth, it doesn't matter so much which one we're using. We're actually so early in the game that we haven't taken a bunch of skill nodes or gear that have us specializing in only cold damage. That will come later, but at this point, most of our skill tree has just been generic increased spell damage, so we'll still get a big damage boost from any element that we add on our wand here. So just whatever resistance ring you pick up that's convenient, or perhaps you'll need to buy one from the vendor, any one of them will do. In theory, if you have a choice, use a sapphire ring for cold, because we do get a little bit of increased cold damage from Frostwalker, but otherwise it doesn't matter too much. For the other components of the recipe, any wand can be upgraded from normal with a white title to magic with a blue title using an orb of transmutation. Or else you can just use any magic rarity wand that you find on the ground. You're going to find plenty. And then finally, orbs of alteration. These are a natural currency drop. You're just going to find them from monsters, but they can be relatively rare this early on in the game. So you may have to assemble one yourself with shards of alteration. 20 shards transforms into one orb of alteration. You get these shards a few at a time by selling identified items to the vendor. This is different from selling unidentified items to the vendor, which would get transmutation shards instead. So in a way, we're kind of indirectly trading in wisdom scrolls for orbs of alteration, since you need to spend the wisdom scrolls to identify items before selling them. And then when you sell them, you will get these shards of alteration. So now you've got the three components: an orb of alteration, a magic wand, a resistance ring. You pop these three components together in the vendor window. Voila, the vendor will gift you a new wand with flat damage on it. This is very powerful right now. The other items you're going to want to keep an eye out for, we're going to need for a later vendor recipe when we replace this wand. Those items, you still want to keep your eye out for them. You don't want to miss them. A blacksmith's whetstone, another type of currency item, and then a chain belt, something that would go on your waist. So we're going to get to that later, but just keep your eye out for them. For now, let's continue talking about these first few levels by switching over to talk about skill gems, the kind of third major important thing on top of the skill passive tree and the weapon that you're going to use. So, skill gems, what actual damage dealing skills are we going to be working with? Well, at the beginning here, there are very limited options for which skill gems to use. We're very early in the game, so which is going to start always with Fireball that she picks up down on the beach, the one you're going to use to kill Hillock. But as soon as you get to town, you want to switch over to Freezing Pulse. This is a gem that we immediately get for free as a quest reward. Now, admittedly, Fireball does deal slightly more damage by virtue of being able to ignite enemies, but Freezing Pulse easily beats it for quality of life by piercing all enemies, so it lets you hit way more enemies at once, and by slowing enemies down with chills and freezes, so it's even a defensive layer too. Our support gem will remain the same though when we switch from Fireball to Freezing Pulse. Arcane Surge, which gives us a boost to spell damage after we've spent a certain amount of mana on the linked spell. Now, we're unlikely to find an item with a third linked socket so early in the game, but you might. It's been known to happen. If you do find a 3 linked item this early, you're really keeping your eyes open for ideally an item with blue, and green linked together. That would allow you to take your current setup of Freezing Pulse and Arcane Surge and also pop in the green gem called Volley support. Volley lets our Freezing Pulse cover a much broader area. So again, blue-blue-green is ideal. Slightly less ideal, but still great, would be a blue-blue-blue item of some kind. All three linked items, or linked sockets being blue. In that case, we would not be able to use Volley, because it's a green gem, but we would add in the blue support gem of added lightning damage instead. So your clear speed suffers a little bit because you're not able to spread it as widely as you could with Volley, but adding this extra damage support will improve your single target damage. So trade-off there. And then likewise, the other potential alternative, if you get a blue-green-green linked item, in that case, you're not going to be able to use the Arcane Surge support, because that's blue. You'll throw in added cold damage instead. Now, just as a kind of handy aside here, Arcane Surge offers a buff in two parts. Partially, it buffs the skill that you're currently using, that it's currently linked to, but also partially it offers a general spell damage boost. So you're not going to get the full Arcane Surge boost, but if you link it to something else, like Frost Blink, your travel skill, or Frost Bomb, your debuffing skill, then you can still get some of Arcane Surge's effect. So now, we've talked about blues and greens, but unfortunately there isn't too much we can do with a red socket if you find one, at least not for our main skill setup. However, it is a great place to pop in a Holy Flame Totem as an ancillary damage dealer. Now, you'll see in the Path of Building that Shack Central does not use this one. This is my option, but if you watched my Arc Witch video, you're going to know that I'm a big fan of this. As mentioned in that video guide, Holy Flame Totem is amazing in our first 10 to 12 levels or so because it distracts both crowds of enemies and individual big enemies. As a major bonus, not just distracting, but since enemies in Act 1 have an amount of health that's balanced around us, the player, only having 3 linked gear, remember that more links equals more damage. What that means is that any 3 link with damage supports can be expected to deal a fair amount of damage to these enemies. So if we get lucky and we have more than one item with 2 or 3 links on it, we can actually have Holy Flame Totem and Freezing Pulse going at the same time. You can lay down the totem. It's kind of an automated turret. It fires its own skill. Meanwhile, you're going to be firing your Freezing Pulse. So you've effectively doubled your DPS by having this. Holy Flame Totem requires a red socket, and then ideally you would want to link it with both a blue socket for Summon Phantasm support, creating even more distractions and damage, and then a green for Volley, just like the Freezing Pulse setup. And as you can probably guess from that last section, you can swap in any combination of Arcane Surge, added Cold, added Lightning, just depending on what links you've got available to you. It's pretty flexible. 3 links is always going to be better than 2. Even if the support gem isn't quite optimal, if you have to choose an alternate, it's fine. It's still going to be good. Unfortunately, multiple red sockets doesn't really do us too much good. The Witch doesn't have access to many red support gems. Different classes start out with access to different gems depending on the theme of the gem. Witches are going to be focused more on spells and intelligence, which you might expect. Those tend to come on blue gems, whereas red gems are typically associated with strength and melee damage and that type of thing. In any case, even on a single red socket, if you've got that single red socket and no links, I do find that Holy Flame Totem is a great addition to the setup. Now, as I alluded to a minute ago, and as is seen in the Path of Building, we do also use Frost Bomb, shown here. It applies a sizable debuff on enemies. We're not using it for the direct damage it deals necessarily, but it debuffs enemies, lowering their resistance to our cold damage and simultaneously preventing them from regenerating health. Let's keep this principle in mind, this idea that we're using more than one skill at once. We're using Holy Flame Totem, Freezing Pulse, Frost Bomb. This business of simultaneously using more than one skill to maximize our damage, we're going to keep that in the forefront of our mind because it's a cornerstone of the build, even in the late game. So now here comes a little point of diversion. At this point, Shack Central does one thing and I do another. From levels 4 to 10, which is going to be around 10 or 15 minutes for an advanced player, and still under an hour, even if you're a very new player and taking, a long time to kind of read through everything, still going to be under an hour. For that duration, he does have you making another swap, using Stormblast Mine and Swift Assembly support as your main damage dealer, then throwing in an added lightning damage as your third link if you do happen to have a 3-linked item for it. This is a perfectly fine setup, and most people agree that it does do slightly more damage than what I'm recommending, but it's just my own preference to do as few skill swaps as possible while leveling. It's just my personal preference. I like the consistency of doing the same thing for a while. And in my opinion, the difference in damage between Freezing Pulse and Stormblast Mine, for the hour or so you'd be using Stormblast as your main skill, it just doesn't warrant the switch to me. It's not that much better. I still do include Frost Bomb, Frost Blink, etc., just as the Path of Building says. It's just that I continue to use Freezing Pulse as my main damage dealer until our true main skill, our endgame main skill of Wintertide brand becomes available. And speaking of which, this just about catches us up to where we were in the skill tree. So let's pop back over there and see where we go next. Apologies, I called it a skill tree, I mean the passive tree. After that first section we covered on the passive tree, you're probably starting to get a little bit to understand how this works. We're going to finish up these skill points from the first couple acts of the game by padding through some life here. This is mandatory. We have to go through here to get to the other things we need. Then we're going to choose whether we want to go for more mana or more damage first. You'll quickly take both. Again, this is just a choice of what you'll do first. And I'm personally going to recommend that you do the damage nodes first. And here's why. These nodes on the left, these are the first nodes you're going to take relating to brands, which, if you're paying attention, you probably detected that Wintertide brand is our main skill, and brands are a special type of spell that have unique behavior that no other spells have. Rather than just being cast directly at enemies, brands are a sort of magical seal or artifact. It's an object that you're placing on the ground, and it will automatically leap to enemies of its own accord and attach itself to them. Now, brands have different effects depending on which one you use. There are several different brands in the game. The focus of this build being Wintertide brand, we'll cover that one. This is a brand that latches onto enemies and applies a degenerative, constant, and escalating cold damage over time effect. The longer it's attached, the more it amps up the DPS. Now, this kind of slightly delayed damage style, where you're not just click the button, watch the thing die, you have to wait for a quarter second for it to leap over and attach, and then it might take a little bit of time for the health to grind down. It can take a little bit of getting used to at first. I definitely understand that. It took some for me, but I've got to tell you, it is super satisfying when you get used to it, and it's very safe. It lets you run around kiting away from damage. It lets you even go ahead to the next pack and let your brands do the dirty work. As an aside there, that's a good reason to have a loot filter that have noises associated with good drops, so that if you run past an enemy while it's still dying, and if something drops behind you, you can hear it and then go back for it. But yeah, you're letting the brands do the dirty work, and you get to run around staying safe and getting ahead of the game. So I'll also point out that, as a bonus, I am publishing this video in patch 3.20 Forbidden Sanctum League, and the Forbidden Sanctum League mechanic benefits a ton from being able to run around and avoid damage while simultaneously doing your own damage. So this build is like custom designed to do well in the current league's mechanic, which I didn't know before I decided to make the guide. It's just a happy coincidence. So taking these brand nodes over here is essential before switching over to Wintertide brand from our first leveling skill, regardless of whether you went Stormblast Mine or stuck with the Freezing Pulse Holy Flame Totem. And the reason it's so essential is this glowing ball in the center of this skill wheel. This ball in the center of the wheel is not just decorative. It's actually a skill node itself called a mastery. Introduced recently, masteries are skill nodes at the center of many skill wheels across the passive tree. They require you to invest a skill point just like any other node, and they apply powerful and unique effects relating to the sort of theme of that skill wheel. You are offered a list of options relating to that theme, and you choose from the same list of options no matter which wheel you're at. So, for example, there are several different wheels across the passive tree dedicated to brands, like this one is. And if you go to any of them, you'll see that the list of mastery options is the same. Now, each mastery option can only be taken once. You can't go to all the different brand masteries and take the same one several times, but you can use several wheels of the same type to take multiple options from the list, and that is frequently what builds will do, and this build does do. So this mastery, this particular mastery, is just so important because it's a huge quality of life boost for brands. Without this mastery, you have to recast your brand for each and every enemy you want to kill, or at least to attach the brand to. It's incredibly tedious, it's click intensive, but with this mastery node taken, your brands will last for their full and considerable duration, and they will just quickly and automatically jump to nearby enemies. So you just throw down a few brands and you watch a pack melt all on its own. You don't have to continue interacting with it. So again, to reiterate, I do recommend making a beeline for the skill mastery so that we can make the switch to Wintertide brand without it feeling like crap. If you do have to take the mana nodes first, like if you're just in a total mana crunch, you can barely cast any of your spells for some reason, then you've got to delay switching to Wintertide brand until you can get those brand nodes. I really can't recommend making the switch first. So, in either case, whether you have to delay or not, the switchover is going to happen around the end of Act 1, preferably right before you face the final Act boss in the Cavern of Anger. The Wintertide brand is going to unlock back at the vendor as soon as you enter the Cavern of Anger. And luckily, the waypoint for the Cavern of Anger is immediately inside the front door. So you just enter the cavern, waypoint back to town, and grab the gem if you're ready to make the switch. One of the only supports that does any good with Wintertide brand this early in the game is efficacy support. So we'll want to link that. The third slot can either be Arcane Surge or added cold damage, depending on socket colors. Neither is particularly great, and we will be swapping it out when a new support becomes available in Act 2. So if you only have Wintertide brand and efficacy, that's okay. That's not a big deal. But now, as we're making this swap, we also have to use the second vendor recipe that I teased earlier, because Wintertide brand does not benefit from flat damage the way our previous skills did. It only benefits from increased percent of damage, so that's the weapon that we're going to shoot for. We are going to be selling a wand of any rarity to the vendor, along with a blacksmith's whetstone and a chain belt. You will get back in return a wand that has percent increased spell damage instead of flat added damage. This is important, like I said, because Wintertide brand just doesn't benefit from the flat damage. There is no hit component to add the damage to. It's just kind of this constant ongoing damage per second. So the wands we're going to get back with the percent increased spell damage, these are great wands. And if you have the materials for a second one, go ahead and make a second one. You can dual wield them instead of having a shield. Grants big added damage here. If you don't have the materials for one or both, that is totally okay. Any wand you pick up off the ground that has some kind of increased spell damage on it will do fine as a substitute. Just make sure it is a percent increased, not a flat number increase, because the flat numbers won't do anything. Do keep in mind with this recipe that the rarity of the chain belt matters. Higher rarity belts will produce wands with a higher percent spell damage, but also higher level requirements. You will want to use white or blue rarity chain belts this first time, but then later in Act 2 you can use rare or yellow title chain belts to create higher damage wands, but they require being level 23 or plus to use, which is why you wait till Act 2. You're likely going to need to use essences at that time to make these belts rare, since rare chain belts don't naturally come along very often as drops. If you don't know, essences are crafting items that let you take a white or normal item, turn it into a rare item with one guaranteed modifier. For this purpose, we don't really care about the guaranteed modifier, we just care about turning it into a rare item. And you get essences only from breaking out the monsters in those icy prisons that you will sometimes come across, represented by 3 jagged, crooked blue lines on your mini-map. You break the monster out, it's a little bit tougher than a normal monster, and you kill it, and it'll always drop an essence. I recommend killing 100% of essence monsters you come across without exception. These are extremely handy to have, both for vendor recipes and just for crafting your own items. Now, as part of this end of Act 1 switch, I will just point out that the brand mastery isn't the only one we're going to be taking. The life and mana wheels over here also take masteries. The life node is a flat 50 life, which is a huge boost early in the game, and it even scales well with percent life nodes that you pick up throughout the leveling process. So great pickup there. And then the mana wheel takes a mastery which reduces the mana reservation cost of the clarity aura. This is handy since we can grab the Clarity and Vitality aura gems at the same time we are grabbing Wintertide brand and Efficacy. We can do it all at once. Just as an aside, Clarity increases your rate of mana regeneration, and Vitality does the same thing for life regeneration. Auras here are a special type of skill which reserve or set aside a portion of your mana so that you can't use it to cast spells, but you do get the constant benefits of the aura instead. Just be careful when leveling up Clarity and Vitality. Unlike most other auras in the game, these auras will increase the amount of mana they reserve as you level them up. Other gems they'll say 25% and it's always 25%. Not these two. So just keep an eye on the amount of mana they're reserving, and if you feel like you're getting to the point where you might be getting towards an uncomfortably small usable mana pool, just stop leveling them. Use your judgment, but if it feels like you're getting close, stop leveling them until you have a chance later to boost up the size of your mana pool. And that there will get us prepared for the final boss of Act 1. We face the boss, and we move on to Act 2. Luckily, at this point, we've really kind of gotten over the hump in terms of needing to give you these massive info dumps. You're going to be starting to catch the basics at this point, so we're really just going to be doing more of the same, and I'm only going to have to add a little bit more detail. So I'm not going to go into as much painstaking detail now about gems and passives and stuff. I'll just mention which ones we're taking. With that said, if there are questions about those things, I'm happy to answer in the comments, if need be. So in Act 2, we're going to make a few changes, but not nearly as many as in Act 1. One change we're going to make is that after the Act 2 quest called Sharp and Cruel, where we kill a giant spider, as a reward we take the Controlled Destruction support gem. We're going to use that to support Wintertide brand in place of whatever your third support gem was. So as a reminder, this means a blue item somewhere on your body. Important to note that it does not need to be your weapon. As long as it is any item on your body with blue, you can pop in your main skill, which is going to be Wintertide brand, Efficacy, and Controlled Destruction. If you've got some spare currency, you should also buy a spare copy of Controlled Destruction, same gem, and level it in an offhanded weapon swap. Incidentally, you can see your offhand weapon swap either by hitting the X key or in your inventory, clicking on the Roman numeral 2 at the top of your weapon slot. Now, later on, we're going to be using this copy of Controlled Destruction when we start adding in other damage-dealing skills. If you followed Shaq's path of going with Stormblast Mine, you won't have gotten rid of Stormblast Mine yet. You'll just, when you've switched over to Wintertide brand, you will have been using it as a kind of supplementary damage for single targets. So if you're going to keep using that, just be on the lookout for a blue-green linked item so that you can swap out Swift Assembly support for the similarly green Trap and Mine damage support, while also adding in the blue support gem of added lightning damage support. That's going to be your third link. If you've been using Holy Flame Totem like I had, feel free to continue doing so, at least for the time being. There's going to come a point where we need to get rid of the totem, but either is fine for the moment. The overall point is to just make sure we're able to deal damage with more than one skill at a time, particularly in bossing situations. That's really the theme of this build. Now, around the same time in Act 2, we're going to be replacing our Vitality and Clarity auras with a different one, which reserves more mana. Summon Skitterbots, which chills and shocks nearby enemies for an offensive and defensive boost. Theoretically, if you've kept Vitality and Clarity at a fairly low level, you might be able to keep them active in addition to Skitterbots. Just experiment with it a bit and use your judgment. If you feel like you've got enough mana to get through an individual encounter with a pack of enemies without running out, then yeah, feel free to keep all three auras active. But if you don't have enough, get rid of Vitality and Clarity for now. We'll have a way in a little bit to bring those back. But for now, you're not gonna you're not gonna die from the lack of them. I hope. But we also pick up a very nice quality of life gem at this point, midway through Act 2, which it doesn't need any links. You can just throw it in any available socket, and it's called Brand Recall, a blue gem. Normally, this is what the gem does. Normally, without this gem, brands will sit in place and need to be recast when you reach a new pack. They'll just kind of chill on the ground once they've detached from an enemy. And it costs around 17 mana per cast to make a new brand. Brand Recall, on the other hand, it interacts with your currently existing brands. It spends just 17 mana, the same amount, but instead of doing something with one brand, it takes all of your currently active brands, wherever they are, and it teleports them to your current location. Avengers Assemble, as long as they haven't expired yet. And so one of the huge quality of life things about this skill is that it is instant cast, which it's hard to explain if you haven't played the game before just how big of a deal it is for a spell to be instant cast. It may not sound too exciting, but try it out. It's a game changer. You're basically able to cast, so to speak, a big stack of all 4 or 5 of your brands without stopping your forward motion. You're just going to be keeping running. You click this button, you're not interrupted, and bam, suddenly your brands are all around you doing massive damage. So it feels really good. This is technically optional. If you prefer to recast your brands at every pack, you're certainly welcome to do that and save a gem slot here. And it's true that even with brand recall, you are going to need to recast the brands eventually, since they do have a limited duration. But with brand recall, you should be able to get through 2 or 3 packs without stopping to recast, and that's a big quality of life boost. Not mandatory, but recommend giving it a try. Now remember, we mentioned this earlier, Act 2 is a good time to make a new wand or two using the rare chain belt vendor recipe, as long as you've got the essences to make that happen, or if by chance perhaps you found a rare chain belt on the ground. Less likely, but possible. So dual wielding these wands, if possible, can basically carry you through the entire game from here. Not exaggerating. That'll get you to the maps at the end of the game. And that should, I think, cover it for the changes in Act 2. And now as we get into Act 3, this is where we're starting to get into some of the real fun stuff. We're going to start fleshing out our build, and it's really going to start bringing its identity together and feeling like itself. And we're going to cap this off by doing our first Labyrinth. And as usual, this happens around the end of Act 3, beginning of Act 4, depending on your preference. And doing our first Labyrinth allows us to claim our first Ascendancy points. Just wanted to give a little bit of an aside here about ascending before we go over some of the other specific changes that are happening to our build in Act 3. For Ascendancy, we're going to ascend a total of 4 times throughout the game. And each time we do it, it makes our build feel more and more distinct, more and more powerful. It gives it more and more of an identity. So the Labyrinth, if you haven't done it before, it's a series of rooms with dangerous traps interspersed with 3 phases of a boss fight. Between each phase of the boss fight, you have to traverse more rooms with traps, and then after beating the boss's 3rd and final phase, you get 2 things. You get the opportunity to enchant an item. It's boring, does very little, but you also get the opportunity to ascend your character, and this is not boring, and it does a lot. Now, be warned though, the Labyrinth can be difficult for first-time players. I remember failing several times before beating my first lab. It's worth taking extra health on the passive tree, navigating towards that before you go. It is sort of a mini hardcore situation, so it's not that your character dies and can't be used anymore, but if you die in the Labyrinth, you do get sent back to the beginning of the Labyrinth and lose all your progress. Even if you killed the boss twice, you're on the 3rd phase and he manages to kill you, well, you're back to the beginning. You've got to go do the whole thing again. It can be very frustrating, so you want to be careful. You want to make sure you have taken your life on the passive tree. You want to take some ways with you of dealing with bleeding, since a lot of the traps inflict bleeding. So I recommend bringing in at least a couple of health flasks with you, if possible, ones that have anti-bleed mods on them. But if not, You can try bringing the Steel Skin defensive skill. That's another instant cast that you can bind to your left click, and this is a skill that reduces a percent of damage and stops bleeding. It can be helpful in the lab, I have found. And also the Vitality Aura. If you switched it off before, now might be a good time to turn it on, at least in the trap area. The boss of the Labyrinth has slow, telegraphed movements, but you gotta dodge him. You gotta dodge him. If you get hit by his slams, unless you are way over leveled and have taken a lot of defensive mechanics, he's just gonna kill you. So yeah, they're easy to dodge, but you gotta dodge it. So anyways, you've beaten that. You are taking your first Ascendancy. You've got a choice now. Just like the passive point ordering we talked about before, it comes down to whether you feel right now you are either too squishy and need a little bit more survivability, or if you're not dealing enough damage. It's offense versus defense. Simple as that. You're eventually going to be taking both anyways, but it's just about how you're going to spend the next 4 acts. Do you want to spend the next 4 acts until your next lab with a little bit more damage or a little bit more defense? So Shack Central's guide has you taking the defensive option, Vile Bastion. It really is a great defensive option. This keeps your energy shield topped up in most situations, but it does require you to put at least a little bit of thought into making sure that there is energy shield on your gear, that there are modifiers for energy shield on your gear. Remember that your main health pool is life, but energy shield is kind of an optional mechanic that shields and protects your life. You cannot heal energy shield with flasks, but it regenerates naturally once you stop taking damage. So if you've ever played Halo, where there is a recharging energy shield, it's like that. You just have to stop taking damage for a bit, and it charges back up to full. But if your gear doesn't have a lot of energy shield on it as a defensive mechanic, then this option may not even do much for you yet. On the other hand, though, it can be a plus to take the defensive option in case it helps you with your next Labyrinth. So that's worth keeping in mind too. The other option, though, is offensive in nature, and that is Void Beacon. This option massively lowers the resistance of nearby enemies to your damage from cold and chaos. And of course, for this build, we care about cold. It also lowers their life regen, which is effective against a lot of enemies. So needless to say, it's going to be particularly important against single target, where a big boss is going to have higher resistance and higher health pool and everything. So, if you feel like you're okay against mobs, but your boss damage feels weak, maybe this is the direction that you want to go. In the lead up to this Labyrinth and Ascendancy choice, you'll continue to expanding your passive tree. The main 4 features are, number 1, you're going to make a beeline for the Rune Binder Keystone. Keystones offer big benefits with big drawbacks, and are usually best used in situations where the drawback doesn't matter to you. Runebinder is going to expand the number of brands we can have out, boosting our DPS massively and our clear speed as well, with the drawback of limiting our number of totems, which we don't care about. We're going to stop using Holy Flame Totem when we take this Keystone. Taking some damage over time multiplier nodes, which are nice because they take many of our other damage increases, like spell damage, increased brand damage, increased cold damage, etc. They multiply all of that. So even small numbers of this damage over time multiplier go a long way. Number 3, taking our second brand-related wheel of skills. This one ending in a deceptively large damage boost. The line, enemies take 5% increased damage per brand attached, sounds pretty humdrum. It sounds pretty small. What we have to keep in mind, though, is that, quote, enemies take increased damage is the final part of the damage calculation. It multiplies literally everything else we do. It multiplies on top of flat damage, on top of increased damage, on top of damage over time multipliers. This is on top of everything. So this is truly 5% increased damage per brand. It's very big. And then number 4, boring but not to be overlooked, we take another life wheel on the passive tree. It's important to try and have your life pool go up by around 300 hit points per act, between taking new gear, taking new passives on the tree. So while it may not be too exciting to spend skill points on life nodes, it is very important, and we do it here. So The last thing we need to do to get our build online, so to speak, and chugging along towards endgame smoothly, is to get a pair of 4-linked items for our 2 main damage skills. 4 links start dropping in areas with monster level 25, which is in the middle of Act 3. Around that time, keep your eyes peeled on the ground and regularly check vendors for 4 links with the following colors. One of them should be blue, 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 green, and the other should be blue, blue, green, green. Into the first one, we socket Wintertide brand, a blue gem, with the 2 blue supports we already had, Efficacy and Controlled Destruction, while adding a new green support gem, Hypothermia. Into the second item, we are placing Vortex, the cold skill we're going to bind to our left click, and have it cast naturally as we walk around. Alternately, you can bind this to a different button and cast it manually if you prefer. That's just a stylistic choice, but many people just bind it to left click and have it cast as you walk. Vortex is a blue gem linked with 1 blue support, the spare Controlled Destruction we picked up back in Act 2, and 2 green gems, Hypothermia and Swift Affliction. Finding items with those sets of links is just a game of luck, and it may take you a while into Act 4 or 5, maybe even longer if you're unlucky, before you've got it fully fleshed out. But you will do just fine with those skills on a 3-link until you can get those 4 links. Around this time, the passive tree goes towards some mana reservation efficiency nodes, lowering the amount of mana reserved by our auras. That means that if you did have to drop Vitality and or Clarity back there to make room for Skitterbots, you can now safely add them back in with mana to spare. More changes do happen to this build as you wrap up the campaign after this, but this video is already plenty long, and this does get us to the point where we are basically online, and there's just little shifts happening until the end game, until the end of the campaign. So let me know if anyone is interested in a follow-up about that end game swap. I'm happy to make another video. In the meantime, this should get you at least online, so thank you for tuning in, and take it easy.